A single whispered conversation in a Tudor bedchamber could change the fate of an entire kingdom. In a court where marriages were treaties and crowns carried the weight of dynasties, private emotions often slipped quietly into the machinery of politics. Kings listened in council chambers, yet their thoughts had already been shaped in far more intimate rooms. Advisors debated law and religion, believing they were guiding the future of England, while the first doubts had begun somewhere else entirely. Tonight, we step into the shadowed halls of the Tudor court to uncover how private whispers slowly became the decisions that reshaped history. So, before you feel comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Only if your heart truly wants to. If you do like it, leave a little comment letting me know what time it is where you are. Now, dim the lights. Adjust the pillow to fit your head. Maybe turn on a fan to create a relaxing atmosphere. And let's begin this journey together tonight. If someone had quietly observed a Tudor palace for a single evening, the structure of power would have seemed simple. At the center stood the king, surrounded by advisors, en noble, and clergy who filled the council chamber with careful arguments. Documents were read aloud. Letters were sealed with wax. And decisions about the kingdom were debated across long wooden tables. Everything appeared orderly, deliberate, and official. From a distance, the Tudor government looked like a system guided entirely by councils and laws. Yet the daily life of the court did not end when the council chamber doors closed. Once the formal discussions ended, the palace slowly changed its rhythm. Courtiers left the public halls and moved toward smaller rooms lit by candles. Servants carried trays of wine through narrow corridors. The noise of political debate faded into the quieter sounds of private conversation. These moments were rarely recorded in documents, yet they formed a large part of how power truly moved within the court. Tudor rulers did not live separate lives as kings and as men. The same person who signed decrees about war and diplomacy also spent his evenings speaking with those closest to him. He shared meals, listened to complaints, and spoke freely about worries that could never be expressed during official meetings. In those private spaces, the distance between government and personal life disappeared. Politics in Tudor England was deeply connected to relationships. Family alliances determined loyalty among nobles. Marriages linked powerful households together. A queen did not represent only herself, but also the influence of her relatives and the diplomatic connections of her homeland. Because of this, emotional relationships inside the palace carried political meaning, whether anyone intended it or not. A conversation about marriage could easily become a discussion about alliances. A complaint about a nobleman could slowly turn into suspicion about his loyalty. Personal feelings often drifted into political judgment without anyone clearly noticing the moment when that change occurred. The king's private life, therefore, became a quiet extension of government. Many of these conversations took place far from the council chamber. They happened in rooms designed for comfort rather than authority. Fires burned in stone hearths to warm the cold air. Heavy curtains covered narrow windows. Chairs were placed close together so that voices could remain low and private. These rooms were meant to be places of rest, but they often became places where opinions were formed. Those who had access to these moments possessed a kind of influence that could never be written into law. A person who spoke with the king in private might shape how he interpreted the events of the day. Small remarks, repeated often enough, could slowly influence his thoughts about allies, enemies, or even his own marriage. In Tudor society, titles did not always determine whose voice carried the most weight. A minister might speak during formal meetings, yet his words competed with those of many other advisors. By contrast, a trusted companion in a private room could speak without interruption. No rivals were waiting to argue, no scribes recording each sentence, and no expectation that every opinion must be justified with evidence. In such a setting, ideas could travel quietly but effectively. This was one reason why the Tudor court was filled with tension beneath its polished surface. Every relationship carried the possibility of political consequences. Friendships between nobles could become alliances. Rivalries could develop into factional struggles. Even the emotional life of the king had the power to alter the direction of national policy. Marriage itself was one of the clearest examples of this connection. A royal marriage was rarely based only on affection. It was a diplomatic agreement that strengthened alliances and stabilized the kingdom. The queen represented legitimacy, continuity, and the promise of heirs who would secure the future of the dynasty. Because of this, the king's personal attachments could easily collide with the expectations of politics. When emotions entered a royal marriage, they did not remain private matters. Court observers watched every change in mood, every gesture of favor, and every rumor that circulated through the palace corridors. A relationship that appeared personal could quickly acquire political meaning. This environment made the Tudor court a place where appearance and reality often moved in different directions. Publicly, authority belonged to councils, laws, and ceremonies. Privately, influence flowed through conversation, trust, and emotional closeness. Both systems existed at the same time, and both affected the decisions made by the king. Many courtiers understood this reality very well. They knew that the path to influence did not always run through official offices. Sometimes it ran through friendship, sometimes through loyalty, and sometimes through intimacy. For historians looking back, these invisible connections are difficult to trace. Official records rarely mention private conversations. Letters hint at alliances and tensions, but they rarely reveal exactly how ideas entered the king's mind. Yet the pattern becomes clear when the events of Tudor history are examined closely. Important decisions often emerged after long periods of quiet discussion within the palace. By the time the council chamber debated a policy, the king's opinion had often begun to form elsewhere. In many cases, that process started in the most private spaces of the court. The Tudor palace was therefore not simply a place of government. It was also a place of personal relationships that carried hidden political weight. The boundaries between affection, loyalty, and authority were rarely clear. In that world, a private conversation could sometimes matter more than a public debate. And the individuals who shared those private moments with the king stood closer to the heart of power than their official position might suggest. Within the Tudor court, political authority and personal relationships were tightly woven together. Behind formal meetings and royal decrees, quiet conversations in private rooms often guided how the king understood the world around him. And among the people who shared those moments were women whose presence seemed personal, yet whose influence could reach far beyond the palace walls. A royal mistress in the Tudor court existed in a position that was both visible and uncertain. She could be seen walking through palace corridors beside the king, dressed in rich fabrics and surrounded by servants. Courtiers noticed when she entered a room. Her presence could draw whispers and careful glances. Yet despite this visibility, her place within the structure of the court remained fragile. Unlike a queen, she possessed no legal recognition. The laws of Tudor England did not grant her authority, property rights, or ceremonial protection. The church recognized only marriage as a legitimate union. Without that bond, a woman who held the king's affection stood outside the official order of society. She could enjoy comfort and influence, but none of it was guaranteed. Everything depended on favor. Favor in a royal court was an unpredictable force. Kings were surrounded by constant pressure from advisors, en nobles, and family members. Political alliances shifted often, and personal emotions could change quickly under such strain. A woman who relied entirely on the king's affection, therefore, lived with a quiet sense of instability. Today, she might receive gifts, apartments, and the attention of powerful courtiers. Tomorrow, she might find the palace doors closed. Many mistresses understood this reality very clearly. their position could not rely on law, tradition, or inheritance. Instead, survival required something far more subtle, influence that moved quietly through relationships. Lease. Because they lacked formal authority, they rarely attempted to speak about politics directly. Doing so would have attracted suspicion from ministers and hostility from noble families loyal to the queen. Open ambition would have been dangerous. A mistress, therefore, learned to operate through indirect means. Conversation became one of her most useful tools. Evenings in Tudor palaces often unfolded slowly. The king withdrew from public duties and spent time in private rooms warmed by a fire. Music might be played softly in the background. Wine was poured. Servants moved carefully through the chamber, keeping their distance while remaining attentive. In these relaxed moments, the king often spoke freely about the frustrations of his day. He might complain about stubborn advisors. He might question the loyalty of certain nobles. Sometimes he spoke about the difficulties of his marriage or the uncertainty surrounding the future of the dynasty. These conversations were not formal discussions of policy, yet they revealed the thoughts that shaped his decisions. A mistress who listened carefully could learn a great deal from such moments. Listening was often more powerful than speaking. By allowing the king to express his worries and doubts, she gained insight into his state of mind. When she responded, her remarks could be gentle and indirect rather than forceful. A small comment might reinforce a suspicion the king already felt. A quiet observation might make him reconsider the behavior of someone at court. Over time, these remarks could accumulate. The king might begin to interpret certain events through the perspective she suggested. A nobleman, who once seemed loyal, could gradually appear unreliable. A political ally might begin to look less trustworthy. These changes rarely happened suddenly. They developed slowly through repeated conversations that appeared harmless on the surface. Because these interactions occurred in private, they often escaped the attention of the council. Ministers focused on debates and official documents. They argued openly about policy and strategy. Meanwhile, the king's personal relationships unfolded in spaces where politics seemed absent. The influence created there was subtle, yet it could quietly shape how the king approached his official duties. The mistress herself remained aware that this influence was fragile. Her closeness to the king also attracted resentment. Courtiers who lost favor sometimes blamed her for the change. Noble families worried that their alliances might weaken if the king's emotions shifted. Even servants carried gossip through the corridors of the palace. Rumors moved quickly in Tudor courts. A whisper about manipulation or ambition could damage a reputation within days. For this reason, many mistresses avoided public displays of authority. They spoke carefully in front of others, and rarely appeared to challenge the queen or the council directly. Their influence, therefore, remained hidden behind appearances of affection and companionship. This created a strange paradox within the Tudor court. The woman who held the king's private attention often possessed no official power at all. Yet her presence beside him meant she heard thoughts and concerns that even trusted ministers might never hear. Access itself became a form of influence. While advisors competed for brief audiences in crowded council meetings, the mistress shared moments when the king was relaxed and reflective. These conditions allowed ideas to travel quietly into his thinking. A suggestion offered gently at the right time could linger in his mind long after the conversation ended. In this way, a position that appeared weak could become unexpectedly significant. The mistress remained vulnerable to sudden disgrace. Yet her closeness to the king allowed her voice to reach places where formal authority could not easily go. This balance between fragility and influence defined her role within the palace. Many people at court understood this delicate dynamic. They watched the king's companions closely, trying to judge which relationships mattered most. A change in his affection could signal deeper political shifts within the kingdom. For courtiers seeking favor or security, the king's private world became a place of careful observation, because within those quiet chambers, the emotional life of the monarch could slowly intersect with the affairs of state. a Tudor mistress stood outside the law, protected by nothing except the king's affection. Yet through patience, observation, and quiet conversation, she could begin to influence the thoughts of the most powerful man in the kingdom. And in a court where power often moved through personal relationships, even a fragile position could become unexpectedly dangerous. The position of a royal wife in the Tudor court rested on foundations that were far stronger than affection, unlike a mistress, whose presence depended on personal favour. A queen stood within a structure protected by religion, law, and tradition. Her authority did not come from private closeness alone, but from institutions that shaped the entire political order of the kingdom. Marriage in Tudor England was not simply a personal bond between two individuals. It was a sacred contract, recognized by the church and reinforced by the law. Once a royal marriage was established, it carried a meaning that extended far beyond the private life of the king. The union symbolized legitimacy, stability, and the continuation of the royal line. Breaking or weakening such a bond could disturb not only a household, but the political balance of the entire realm. Because of this, the Queen occupied a position that was formally acknowledged and carefully protected. The Church regarded marriage as a solemn vow that could not easily be dissolved. Religious authorities treated the Queen as the lawful partner of the monarch, and this recognition carried enormous influence in a society where religious doctrine shaped public life. Any attempt to challenge the marriage, therefore, required careful justification and often provoked controversy. The law reinforced this protection. Royal marriages were linked to inheritance, property, and diplomatic agreements. The Queen's status helped determine the legitimacy of future heirs. If a child was born within a recognized marriage, that child possessed a clear claim to the throne. Without such legitimacy, succession could become uncertain and dangerous, inviting disputes among rival families. For this reason, the Queen's role carried political importance that extended far beyond the palace walls. She represented alliances between powerful houses or even between kingdoms. Many Tudor marriages were arranged to strengthen diplomatic relationships or secure peace between rival powers. When a foreign princess became Queen of England, she brought with her the prestige and expectations of her homeland. Her presence at court reminded observers that the kingdom stood within a wider network of political relationships. Courtiers understood this significance very well. Noble families often aligned themselves with the Queen because her position appeared stable and enduring. Serving her household offered access to influence that could last for years. Ladies-in-waiting, secretaries, and attendants formed an entire network around the Queen, reinforcing her visibility and importance within the court. Ceremony played an important role in maintaining this authority. Public appearances carefully displayed the Queen's legitimacy. When she entered the great halls beside the king, courtiers witnessed a symbol of lawful union and dynastic continuity. Rich fabrics, jewels, and formal processions were not merely decoration. They reminded everyone present that the Queen embodied the dignity of the crown and the promise of future heirs. Through these rituals, the court affirmed a sense of order. The Queen's presence suggested stability within a world often filled with uncertainty. In an age when succession crises could lead to civil war, the lawful wife of the king represented continuity. Her role reassured nobles and subjects alike that the royal household remained secure. Yet this stability depended heavily on perception. A queen's authority rested partly on the belief that her marriage was strong and legitimate. If doubts emerged about loyalty, fertility, or political alliances, the confidence surrounding her position could weaken. The court watched closely for any sign that the royal marriage might be troubled. These observations were not simply gossip. They carried political implications that reached far beyond personal relationships. A strained marriage could threaten diplomatic alliances or raise questions about the future of the dynasty. If the Queen failed to produce an heir, the stability she symbolized might begin to appear fragile. Despite these potential vulnerabilities, The queen still possessed advantages that no mistress could claim. Her role was recognized publicly. The law acknowledged her marriage. The church defended the sanctity of the union. Together, these forces created a powerful shield around her status. Even if personal affection faded, the institutions supporting her position remained strong. This contrast between official authority and private relationships created a tension within the Tudor court. The queen represented lawful order, tradition, and political alliance. A mistress, by contrast, existed outside that structure. Yet the presence of both figures within the same palace could quietly disturb the balance that royal marriage was meant to protect. Courtiers noticed these dynamics carefully. They understood that the king's personal life could influence the stability of the realm. Every change in his affections raised questions about the future of alliances and the security of succession. Observers watched the interactions between the queen and her companions with a mixture of curiosity and concern. Because within the Tudor court, personal relationships never remained entirely private. Even emotions could carry political consequences. The Tudor queen stood within a marriage protected by religion, law, and tradition. Her presence symbolized stability, alliance, and the lawful continuation of the dynasty. Yet inside the same palace, other relationships quietly existed that could begin to challenge the certainty her position was meant to represent. Private conversations inside a Tudor palace often appeared harmless to anyone who observed them from a distance. The rooms where these discussions took place were small compared with the vast halls used for ceremonies. Curtains softened the stone walls. Candles burned quietly in iron holders, and the air carried the faint smell of wax and smoke. Servants moved carefully along the edges of the chamber, leaving the king and his companion to speak in comfort. In such rooms, the atmosphere felt far removed from the tensions of government. There were no council tables covered with documents. No ministers stood waiting to present arguments. No scribes were halted to record each sentence for the royal archives. The king could speak without the careful restraint required during formal meetings. These moments of privacy created a different kind of conversation. Instead of policy debates, discussions often began with ordinary observations. The king might speak about events that occurred earlier in the day. He might describe disagreements among his advisors or express frustration with a noble family whose loyalty seemed uncertain. At times, he might mention difficulties within his own household. A trusted companion, listening beside the fire, could respond gently. Her replies rarely sounded like political advice. They appeared to be simple remarks offered in sympathy or curiosity. A question might be asked about a certain courtier's intentions. A comment might suggest that a particular ally had not behaved with the loyalty expected of him. These remarks did not resemble commands or arguments. They were small suggestions that entered the king's thoughts quietly. Yet the environment in which they were spoken gave them unusual weight. When a person speaks in a relaxed and intimate setting, the listener often lowers their defenses. Words that might seem unconvincing in a crowded council chamber can appear persuasive in a private conversation shared between two people. Over time, these gentle suggestions could begin to shape how the king interpreted events around him. A nobleman who once seemed trustworthy might slowly appear suspicious. A political ally might begin to look less reliable. These changes did not emerge suddenly. They developed gradually as ideas were repeated, refined, and remembered. By the time the king returned to the council chamber, his perspective might already be shifting. Ministers presenting their arguments often believed they were influencing the king's thinking for the first time. They debated policy with confidence, convinced that careful reasoning would guide the final decision. In reality, the king sometimes entered these discussions with opinions already forming in his mind. Those opinions might have begun somewhere entirely different. The royal bedchamber, though associated with rest and privacy, could become a place where the earliest stages of political judgment took shape. Emotional conversations and quiet reflections sometimes provided the first seeds of decisions that would later appear in royal proclamations. To observers outside those rooms, the process remained invisible. Courtiers rarely knew exactly what had been said in the king's private chambers. Servants carried rumours through the palace corridors, but their stories were often incomplete. Without witnesses or written records, the true origin of many ideas remained hidden behind the formal language of official announcements. This separation between private influence and public decision created a curious illusion. The council chamber seemed to be the centre of power. It was there that arguments were heard and policies debated. Yet the direction of those debates could be quietly guided long before the meeting began. A personal remark made beside a fire might later appear as a carefully reasoned political conclusion. This dynamic did not always arise from deliberate manipulation. Sometimes a companion simply expressed concern or repeated a rumour she had heard elsewhere in the palace. But even such casual comments could shape the king's thoughts if they reached him during moments of reflection. The emotional life of the monarch, therefore, became closely connected to the political life of the kingdom. Kings were not immune to doubt or frustration. When they spoke privately about their fears or disappointments, the responses they received could influence their understanding of loyalty, trust, and betrayal. Over time, these emotional interpretations might guide their actions in matters of state. For the council, this influence remained difficult to detect. Ministers focused on evidence and argument. They analysed alliances, finances, and legal precedents. Yet they could not easily measure the quiet effect of a conversation that occurred far from their view. By the time they attempted to persuade the king, his interpretation of events might already be shaped by earlier discussions. This difference between appearance and reality was one of the defining features of the Tudor court. Publicly, authority belonged to official institutions. Privately, influence moved through personal relationships that were never fully recorded. Decisions that seemed to emerge from careful debate sometimes had their origins in far more intimate settings. Within these hidden spaces, even a single remark could carry surprising consequences. Because when private conversation crossed the invisible boundary between personal life and political judgment, its effects could travel much farther than anyone in the council chamber realized. Within the Tudor palace, private conversation often appeared distant from the serious business of government. Yet the quiet remarks exchanged in intimate rooms could slowly shape how the king interpreted the world around him. And when those thoughts finally reached the council chamber, few people could trace where the first idea had truly begun. In the quiet rhythm of Tudor court life, suspicion rarely appeared suddenly. It developed slowly through repeated observations, small remarks, and subtle comparisons. No accusation needed to be spoken openly. Instead, doubt could grow in the king's mind through conversations that seemed casual and personal. These conversations often took place during moments of calm. Evenings in the palace were quieter than the crowded hours of court ceremony. Fires burned low in stone hearths, casting moving shadows along the walls. Servants withdrew after placing wine or fruit on nearby tables. The atmosphere allowed the king to relax after the strain of public duties. In such moments, discussions rarely began with political arguments. They might begin with ordinary reflections about the day. A disagreement in the council could be mentioned with mild irritation. A nobleman's behaviour might be described with curiosity. Gradually, the topic could move toward more personal matters, especially the royal marriage. The king's relationship with his queen carried constant pressure. Marriage in the Tudor court was expected to produce heirs who would secure the future of the dynasty. The birth of a healthy son promised stability and continuity. Without that certainty, anxiety could spread through the palace and across the kingdom. Because of this expectation, discussions about family life easily took on political meaning. A companion who wished to influence the king did not need to criticize the queen directly. A quiet observation could be enough. She might mention how distant the queen seemed during a recent ceremony. She might recall how little conversation had passed between husband and wife during a public dinner. These remarks sounded like simple observations, yet repeated often enough. They could encourage the king to examine his marriage through a more critical lens. What had once seemed like ordinary behavior might begin to appear as indifference. A quiet queen might suddenly appear cold. A reserved expression could be interpreted as a lack of affection. The suggestion did not need to be strong. In fact, subtlety often made the influence more effective. When a person believes he has concluded on his own, the idea feels more convincing than if it had been forced upon him. Gentle hints allowed the king to believe that the doubts forming in his mind were his own thoughts, rather than someone else's argument. Another source of tension involved the question of heirs. The Tudor dynasty depended heavily on the birth of male successors. Without them, the future of the throne could become uncertain, inviting conflict among rival families. The queen's ability to produce children, therefore, carried immense significance. If pregnancies ended in tragedy or failed to produce sons, anxiety could quietly grow. A mistress might refer to this difficulty in ways that seemed sympathetic rather than critical. She might express concern about the future of the kingdom. She might wonder aloud whether the king deserved a stronger chance of securing the dynasty. Such comments sounded thoughtful and loyal. Yet, they could lead the king to reconsider the meaning of events that had once been accepted as unfortunate accidents. The absence of a son might gradually appear not as chance, but as a problem that demanded attention. Through this process, personal disappointment could slowly transform into political concern. What began as a private reflection about family life might eventually appear as a matter affecting the stability of the realm. Once framed in this way, the question of marriage could be discussed, not as a personal issue, but as a responsibility toward the kingdom. This transformation gave private emotion a new kind of power. When doubts about the royal marriage reached this stage, advisors in the council chamber could begin discussing the issue using legal and religious arguments. They might analyze the legitimacy of the union or the possibility of annulment. Yet by that time, the emotional foundation of the debate had often been laid elsewhere. The original seed of doubt might have been planted during a quiet conversation beside a fire. In the Tudor court, these moments carried particular significance because the king stood at the center of both personal and political worlds. His feelings about loyalty, affection, and disappointment could influence how he judged the stability of alliances and the future of the dynasty. A suggestion made in private, therefore, possessed the potential to travel far beyond its original setting. Observers within the palace sometimes sensed this dynamic, even if they could not hear the conversations themselves. They noticed changes in the king's attitude towards certain advisors or toward the queen herself. A slight distance in public appearances could provoke rumors among courtiers. The palace corridors filled quickly with speculation. Yet, the earlier stages of that transformation remained hidden in the private spaces of the royal household. There, doubt could be introduced carefully and allowed to grow slowly until it appeared natural and inevitable. In this way, personal conversations could begin to influence matters that affected the entire kingdom. Doubt rarely entered the Tudor court as an open accusation. It grew quietly through small remarks about distance, loyalty, and the uncertain future of the royal line. Once those doubts settled in the king's mind, the boundary between private disappointment and political action could begin to fade. In the Tudor court, the thoughts of the king carried consequences far beyond his personal life. Every doubt, frustration, or hope within his mind had the potential to influence decisions that affected the entire kingdom. Because of this, understanding the king's fears and anxieties could become a powerful path toward influence. One of the deepest concerns for any Tudor monarch was the question of succession. The stability of the dynasty depended on the existence of a clear heir. Without a son to inherit the throne, uncertainty could spread quickly through the political world. Noble families began to calculate their interests. Foreign powers watched carefully for signs of weakness. Even ordinary subjects sensed the danger of an unclear future. For the king, this pressure was constant. Each year, without a male heir, strengthened the anxiety surrounding the crown. The problem was not only personal disappointment, but also the fear that the dynasty itself might weaken. Memories of earlier conflicts over succession still lingered in English political culture. No ruler wished to leave behind a kingdom vulnerable to division. Within the private life of the palace, this anxiety often appeared in quiet reflections. A king might speak about the uncertainty of the future while sitting beside a fire after a long day of council meetings. He might wonder whether the kingdom would remain stable if he failed to produce a strong heir. Such concerns were natural for a ruler whose responsibility extended across generations. A companion who listened carefully to these reflections could understand where his fears were strongest. Rather than offering direct political advice, influence could begin through sympathy. A mistress might express concern about the same uncertainty the king already felt. She might speak about the importance of securing the future of the realm, or the danger that rivals might take advantage of a weak succession. These comments did not sound like criticism. They appeared to agree with the king's own worries. When repeated gently over time, such remarks could strengthen the sense that the problem demanded attention. What once felt like an unfortunate circumstance might begin to appear as a serious threat to the kingdom. Another emotion that could quietly grow within the king's mind was the feeling of betrayal. Royal marriages were expected to create loyalty and harmony within the palace. The queen represented not only a personal partner, but also a political alliance. If the relationship seemed distant or strained, the king might interpret that distance as a form of disloyalty. A careful remark could deepen that interpretation. A companion might mention how cold the queen appeared during a recent ceremony. She might wonder why the queen spoke so little during important gatherings. These observations did not accuse the queen of wrongdoing. Instead, they encouraged the king to question whether his marriage provided the support and devotion expected from a royal union. Gradually, the king might begin to examine his own experiences through a new perspective. Moments that once seemed ordinary could appear more troubling. Silence might be interpreted as indifference. A disagreement might seem like disrespect. Through this process, small emotional tensions could take on greater meaning. Over time, these feelings could lead to a deeper conclusion. If the royal marriage produced anxiety rather than stability, the king might begin to view it not as a foundation of strength, but as a barrier to the future he desired. The union that once symbolized alliance and order could begin to appear as an obstacle, preventing the secure continuation of the dynasty. This transformation did not happen quickly. It developed slowly through repeated reflections, quiet conversations, and the natural pressure of political responsibility. By the time such thoughts reached the council chamber, they often appeared as carefully reasoned concerns about the future of the kingdom. Yet the emotional foundation of those concerns had formed earlier. The Tudor court, therefore, existed in a delicate balance between personal feeling and political calculation. A king's private fears about heirs, loyalty, and marriage could gradually influence how he judged the structure of his own household. Those who shared his private hours sometimes understood this better than anyone else. They recognized that the path to influence did not require loud arguments or public declarations. It required patience, observation, and the ability to guide the king's reflections without appearing to do so. In a court where personal relationships carried enormous weight, shaping the king's emotions could eventually shape the direction of the realm. The anxieties of a Tudor king often centered on heirs, loyalty, and the uncertain future of his dynasty. Through quiet sympathy and repeated observation, these fears could slowly grow into deeper doubts about the strength of his marriage. When such doubts settled firmly in the king's mind, the royal union itself could begin to appear less like a foundation of stability and more like an obstacle to the future he desired. Royal power in the Tudor court appeared to operate through carefully organized institutions. Councils gathered in large chambers, where advisors spoke in turn. Ministers presented reports, and clerks recorded the words that shaped the kingdom's policies. Observers who watched these gatherings could easily believe that the direction of the realm was decided within those formal discussions. The reality inside the palace was far more complicated. Long before the council assembled around its heavy wooden tables, The king had already spent hours in a very different environment. Private chambers within the palace offered a quieter world where the pressure of government seemed to fade. Thick curtains covered narrow windows. Fires burned slowly against stone walls. The rooms were arranged not for debate but for comfort. These spaces belonged to the private life of the monarch. Here, the king could set aside the rigid ceremony that defined public appearances. Instead of addressing ministers and ambassadors, he spoke with a small circle of companions whose presence felt familiar and relaxed. Conversations unfolded at a slower pace, often drifting between personal reflections and memories of the day's events. The tone of these discussions differed greatly from the language of politics. A king might speak about a disagreement that occurred during the council meeting earlier in the afternoon. He might describe a particular advisor whose proposal seemed unconvincing. At other times, he might simply express uncertainty about a decision that required careful thought. A companion listening beside the hearth could respond quietly. Her response rarely sounded like political advice. Instead, it resembled ordinary conversation. She might ask whether a certain noble had always been trustworthy. She might wonder aloud if an advisor's suggestion truly served the interests of the kingdom. Such remarks did not resemble arguments. They entered the king's thoughts gently, almost unnoticed. Yet the environment in which they were spoken gave them unusual influence. During council meetings, the king faced a room filled with competing voices. Advisors interrupted each other, challenged opinions, and attempted to prove their loyalty through forceful persuasion. Under those conditions, every suggestion became part of a contest for attention. Inside the private chambers, the situation was very different. No rival voices were waiting to object. No clerks recorded the conversation. The king could listen without feeling the need to defend his authority. In this quieter setting, ideas had more space to settle into his mind. The intimacy of the room created a unique advantage for those who shared it. A remark made in such circumstances could remain in the king's memory long after the conversation ended. What seemed like a passing observation during the evening might influence how he interpreted events the following morning. By the time the council gathered again, the king's perspective might already be shifting. Ministers entering the chamber believed they were presenting new arguments to persuade the monarch. They debated alliances, finance, and law with careful logic. Yet their words were often received by a king whose opinions had already begun forming during earlier conversations. A suggestion heard beside a quiet fire could alter how he interpreted the arguments placed before him. A minister who once seemed convincing might now appear doubtful. A proposal that once seemed uncertain might suddenly feel reasonable. In this way, the tone of the council's debate could be shaped long before the discussion began. Those observing the council rarely noticed this hidden process. From their perspective, the meeting followed its usual structure. Advisors spoke, disagreements were voiced, and the king eventually announced his decision. The ceremony of political authority remained intact. Yet the origins of that decision sometimes lay elsewhere. Private rooms within the palace functioned as an unseen stage where the earliest versions of political ideas quietly emerged. Conversations that seemed personal could slowly guide the king's understanding of events, shaping the questions he asked and the doubts he carried into the council chamber. Servants walking through the corridors occasionally sensed that something important was unfolding behind closed doors. They saw which individuals were welcomed into the king's chambers during the evening hours. They noticed mood changes the following morning. But the full meaning of those conversations remained hidden. The Tudor court, therefore, operated through two parallel worlds. One world was visible and ceremonial, defined by councils, documents, and official declarations. The other existed quietly within the private life of the palace, where trust and familiarity allowed influence to grow without public recognition. Decisions that appeared formal and deliberate often carried traces of those earlier conversations. The king might present his judgment as the result of careful consideration during the council meeting. Advisors might believe their arguments had persuaded him, Yet the earliest spark of the decision might have appeared much earlier, during a calm exchange of words in a private room. The distance between these two moments was often impossible to trace. Private thought gradually became public policy. What began as a quiet reflection beside the hearth could eventually travel through the machinery of government until it appeared as the will of the crown. Public authority in the Tudor court appeared to rise from debates held in the council chamber. Yet many decisions had already begun forming during quiet conversations inside the king's private rooms. By the time ministers gathered to argue their cases, the earliest direction of the kingdom's policy had often been decided elsewhere. Power in the Tudor court often appeared to operate through written orders and carefully recorded debates. Documents sealed with wax travelled through the palace corridors, carrying decisions that affected nobles, clergy, and entire regions of the kingdom. Councils met beneath painted ceilings where advisors argued about alliances, a law, and the stability of the realm. To anyone watching these ceremonies, the government of England seemed to rest firmly on official records and visible institutions. Yet some of the most influential moments in Tudor politics left no trace in any document. These moments unfolded in places where scribes were never invited. Private chambers inside the palace offered a space far removed from the formal structure of administration. Thick curtains softened the cold stone walls. Candles burned low beside carved wooden beds. The atmosphere was quiet enough that voices rarely needed to rise above a murmur. Within such rooms, conversation carried a different tone. The king was no longer surrounded by ministers eager to defend their positions. Instead, he spoke with companions who shared the most private parts of his life. These exchanges were not intended to shape the future of the kingdom. They were meant to ease the burdens of the day, offering a place where thoughts could be expressed without ceremony or caution. A king might speak about frustrations that he never revealed in public. He could question the loyalty of certain advisors or express doubts about decisions that had been discussed earlier in the council. At times, he might reflect on the pressures surrounding his marriage, the expectations of producing heirs, or the tension that surrounded the royal household. In this intimate setting, the distance between personal emotion and political thought became very small. A companion listening carefully might respond with sympathy rather than argument. Her words would not resemble the formal language used in council meetings. Instead, they might appear as simple observations about loyalty, trust, or the uncertain future of the dynasty. These remarks rarely sounded important at the moment they were spoken, yet the quiet environment gave them unusual influence. Without competing voices or official scrutiny, ideas could settle gradually into the king's mind. A comment about a nobleman's behavior might linger long after the conversation ended. A reflection about the difficulties of marriage could slowly alter the king's view of his own household. Because such discussions occurred in the most private corners of the palace, they remained invisible to the rest of the court. No clerk recorded the exchange. No witnesses stood nearby to repeat what had been said. Servants moving through the corridors could only guess at the meaning behind closed doors. Even the most attentive courtiers rarely knew exactly how these conversations unfolded. Despite this secrecy, their consequences could spread widely. The following day, the king might enter the council chamber with a new perspective. An advisor whose loyalty once seemed unquestioned might now face unexpected skepticism. A policy that had once appeared certain might suddenly encounter hesitation. To those present in the council meeting, these changes seemed to arise naturally from debate. Ministers assumed that their arguments had persuaded the king. They believed the discussion unfolding before them represented the true process of decision-making. Yet the origins of those shifts in attitude often lay far beyond the walls of the council chamber. They began in conversations that no one else had heard. Within the Tudor palace, the bedchamber was not intended as a place where politics should develop. Its purpose was rest and privacy. Yet the closeness of that environment allowed thoughts to move freely between personal concerns and questions of power. A remark, offered quietly during an evening conversation, might return to the king's mind during a formal meeting the next day. Over time, These quiet reflections could influence how the king interpreted the arguments placed before him. What appeared to be a sudden decision might actually be the result of many earlier conversations that had taken place without witnesses. This hidden pathway between intimacy and authority became one of the most subtle forces within the Tudor court. While ministers debated policy and clerks recorded decrees, another process unfolded quietly in the background. Personal trust and emotional closeness sometimes guided the king's thinking before any official discussion had begun. The consequences of those unseen conversations could eventually reach every corner of the palace. Courtiers might notice changes in the king's favour. Alliances between noble families could strengthen or collapse. Even the position of the queen might begin to feel less secure if the king's thoughts turned in a new direction. All of these developments could trace their origins back to moments that left no written evidence. They existed only in memory. And within the quiet walls of the bedchamber, those memories could slowly influence the future of the court. Some of the most influential moments in the Tudor court occurred in rooms where no record was ever written. Private conversations beside the bed carried ideas that later entered the council chamber, disguised as deliberate policy. Though no witness could describe where those ideas began, their consequences could eventually spread through the entire court. Whispers in the Tudor court rarely sounded like political plans. They appeared instead as quiet remarks exchanged in narrow corridors, beside the hearth of a private chamber, or during slow evenings when the palace had grown calm. No documents were prepared, no advisors gathered to discuss strategy. Yet these small conversations could begin a process that eventually reached the highest level of power. The strength of a whisper did not lie in its volume. Its strength came from repetition and timing. When an idea is introduced quietly and repeated over time, it can gradually alter how a listener understands the people around them. In the Tudor palace, where the king's interpretation of loyalty shaped the fate of nobles and families, such subtle influence could become extremely powerful. A companion who wished to guide the king's thinking did not need to accuse anyone openly. Instead, she could begin with questions. Questions carried a different tone from accusations. They sounded curious rather than hostile. A remark might appear harmless at first. A companion might wonder whether the queen seemed unusually distant during a recent ceremony. She might ask whether the queen's relatives truly supported the interests of the English crown. These comments did not demand immediate conclusions. They simply encouraged the king to reconsider events he had already witnessed. Once the idea had been introduced, the king might begin to observe the queen's behaviour through a different lens. Small gestures that had once seemed ordinary could now appear meaningful. Silence might seem like indifference. A cautious expression might resemble quiet disapproval. Through this process, the interpretation of ordinary behaviour began to shift. A queen's reserved personality, once accepted as part of her character, could gradually be interpreted as emotional distance. A disagreement within the royal household might appear not as a temporary conflict, but as evidence of a deeper division. The whisper had planted the first seed. From that moment forward, the king himself continued the process of interpretation. He watched more carefully, searching for signs that confirmed the doubts beginning to form in his mind. Whispers also worked effectively because they rarely appeared alone. In a palace crowded with courtiers, rumours travelled easily. Servants repeated stories they had overheard. Noble families discussed the king's household during quiet gatherings. Even the smallest incident could grow larger as it passed from one listener to another. A suggestion made privately could therefore echo through the corridors of the court. If the king heard similar doubts repeated by different voices, the idea seemed increasingly credible. What began as a single observation might gradually appear to be a shared concern within the palace. In this way, a whisper slowly transformed into something more structured. Once doubt had taken hold, it could begin to influence the king's judgment. A moment of hesitation from the queen might seem suspicious. A political alliance connected to her family might suddenly appear uncertain. The king might begin to interpret events not as isolated occurrences, but as signs of a larger problem within his marriage. This change in perception created a new atmosphere in the court. Courtiers noticed when the king's attitude shifted. They watched carefully to see whether the queen still enjoyed the same level of attention during public ceremonies. Even small changes in seating arrangements or gestures of courtesy could provoke speculation among observers. Rumors spread quickly in such an environment. As these rumors circulated, the doubts that began as whispers gained additional strength. What had once been a private concern now seemed to reflect the broader mood of the court. At this stage, suspicion could begin to influence political thinking. If the king questioned the loyalty of his queen, he might also begin to question the alliances connected to her. Advisors who supported the queen's position could face increased scrutiny. Decisions that once appeared purely diplomatic might now carry emotional weight. A whisper had gradually become something more deliberate. The king's personal doubts could now be expressed in the language of responsibility. Questions about loyalty could be framed as concerns for the security of the kingdom. Private disappointment might begin to appear as a political problem requiring attention. By the time these concerns reached the council chamber, they often seemed logical and unavoidable. Ministers might debate legal interpretations or diplomatic consequences, believing that they were addressing a newly discovered issue. Yet the origin of that issue often lay in far quieter conversations that took place beyond the reach of official discussion. Within the Tudor court, whispers possessed a remarkable ability to travel. They moved from private conversation to palace rumor, from rumor to suspicion, and from suspicion to political reasoning. Each stage added a sense of legitimacy to the idea until it appeared strong enough to justify action. What began as a question could eventually become a decision, and once the king himself believed the doubt, the whisper no longer needed to remain hidden. It had already transformed into a strategy. A whisper inside the Tudor palace rarely sounded like a plan for political change. Yet repeated questions and quiet observations could slowly reshape how the king interpreted loyalty within his own household. Once suspicion settled in his mind, the path from private doubt to decisive action could unfold with surprising speed. Influence inside the Tudor court rarely remained confined to a single conversation. Once an idea began to form in the king's mind, it often travelled outward through the social networks that filled the palace. These networks were made of friendships, family connections, and shared loyalties among noble households. Together, they created an invisible web of communication that allowed rumours, concerns, and ambitions to move quietly across the court. The Tudor palace was never a silent place. Hundreds of individuals lived and worked within its walls. Noblemen attended the king. Ladies served the queen. Clerks copied documents, and servants carried messages between chambers. Every corridor, staircase, and courtyard became a place where information could be exchanged in passing conversation. Within this crowded environment, relationships mattered deeply. Noble families relied on one another for support and protection. Friendships formed through marriage, service, or shared interests. These bonds allowed individuals to trust certain voices more than others. When a rumor or observation came from a familiar ally, it carried greater weight. A mistress who wished to strengthen her influence could benefit from these connections. She rarely acted alone. Behind her often stood relatives, friends, and loyal courtiers who understood the advantages of her position. These individuals did not always appear to support her openly. Instead, they worked quietly within the palace community, repeating certain ideas or reinforcing particular interpretations of events. Such efforts rarely looked organized. A conversation during dinner might include a remark about tension within the royal household. A noblewoman might mention that the queen appeared distant during a recent ceremony. Another courtier might quietly wonder whether certain alliances connected to the queen truly served the interests of the crown. Each remark sounded harmless on its own, yet together they created a pattern that others began to notice. The strength of this network came from its ability to spread information gradually. No single statement appeared dramatic enough to attract suspicion. Instead, Small comments circulated through private gatherings and informal meetings. Over time, the same concerns appeared again and again, spoken by different voices. When an idea is repeated by several people, it begins to sound less like a rumor and more like a shared understanding. Courtiers, listening to these conversations, might conclude that many individuals had noticed the same problem. Even those who had not personally witnessed anything unusual could begin to believe that tension within the royal household was widely recognized. Through this process, whispers turned into common belief. Family connections played an important role in sustaining these networks. Noble families often worked together to protect their interests at court. If a relative or ally enjoyed the king's favor, the entire family benefited. For this reason, some households quietly supported the influence of the royal mistress. Their involvement did not require dramatic actions. A brother might repeat certain concerns during a discussion with fellow courtiers. A cousin serving in another part of the palace might share observations that reinforced existing suspicions. Each small contribution strengthened the impression that something within the royal household was changing. Information traveled along these connections with surprising speed. A remark spoken in a private chamber during the evening could appear in conversations across the palace by the following morning. Servants overheard fragments of the discussion and repeated them elsewhere. Courtiers carried impressions from one gathering to another. Within a few days, the same idea might be circulating throughout the court. The king himself sometimes encountered these echoes. When multiple voices repeated similar observations, the doubts already forming in his mind seemed increasingly justified. A concern first raised during a private conversation now appeared to reflect the broader mood of the palace. This development made the original whisper more powerful. What began as a personal suggestion gradually became an atmosphere of shared suspicion. Advisors approaching the king might sense that his confidence in the queen had weakened. Courtiers loyal to the queen might notice a shift in how others spoke about the royal marriage. These changes rarely occurred through formal declarations. They appeared instead through subtle signals. Altered tones of conversation, careful glances during public ceremonies, and quiet discussions behind closed doors. The network of nobles surrounding the court amplified each small remark until it seemed part of a larger truth. By the time the council began discussing the situation openly, the idea had already spread through much of the palace. Ministers might believe they were responding to a growing political concern, yet the roots of that concern had been cultivated earlier, within a web of relationships that connected friends, families, and loyal supporters. In the Tudor court, influence rarely moved in straight lines. It travelled through conversations, alliances, and shared interests. Each participant in the network repeated small fragments of information, gradually transforming a private suspicion into a widely accepted perception. What began as a whisper within the king's chamber could therefore expand outward until the entire court seemed to recognize the same problem. The strategy required patience rather than force, and within the crowded corridors of the palace, patience often proved more effective than open power. Influence within the Tudor court rarely remained confined to a single private conversation. Through networks of friends, relatives, and loyal courtiers, quiet suspicions could spread gradually across the palace. By the time the council began to address the issue openly, the whisper had already become a belief shared throughout the court. Appointments within the Tudor court often appeared to follow formal procedures. Positions were announced through royal orders, and servants were assigned to households according to rank and duty. To observers, these changes seemed like ordinary adjustments within the complex structure of palace administration. Yet behind many of these decisions lay quieter influences. The royal household was a carefully organized environment where every position carried significance. Ladies who attended the queen, secretaries who delivered messages, and stewards who managed daily routines all formed part of a network that shaped the flow of information inside the palace. Those who controlled access to the monarch or the queen often possessed more influence than their titles suggested. For this reason, personnel changes could alter the balance of power within the court. A mistress, seeking to strengthen her position, rarely attempted dramatic confrontations. Instead, influence often appeared through small shifts in the composition of the palace households. These adjustments might seem administrative at first, yet they could gradually reshape the relationships surrounding the queen and the king. One of the most sensitive areas involved the attendants who served the queen. The queen's household functioned as both a domestic and political space. Ladies-in-waiting accompanied her during public ceremonies and private hours alike. They carried messages, observed daily interactions, and maintained connections with noble families beyond the palace walls. Because of this, the composition of the queen's household held strategic importance. If a lady-in-waiting was replaced by another woman more sympathetic to the king's favoured companion, the atmosphere around the queen could begin to shift. Conversations within her chambers might travel more easily beyond those walls. Private frustrations or disagreements could become topics of discussion elsewhere in the palace. These changes rarely appeared deliberate. Official explanations often described them as routine adjustments within the household. A lady might be reassigned to another noble family. Another might leave the court due to marriage or illness. New attendants entered the palace quietly, taking their place within the queen's circle. Over time, however, the pattern became noticeable. Individuals who held loyalty to the mistress or to families aligned with her interests began to appear more frequently within the palace staff. Their presence created a subtle network that extended beyond the king's private chambers into the daily life of the court. Through this network, information moved more easily. An observation made within the queen's apartments might reach other courtiers by evening. A moment of tension during a public appearance could be discussed among allies of the mistress before the day had ended. The queen herself might remain unaware of how widely such details were shared. At the same time, supporters of the queen could gradually lose their positions. This process did not require open accusations. A loyal attendant might simply be reassigned to another duty outside the palace. A trusted servant might find his responsibilities transferred to someone else. Each change appeared minor, yet together they slowly weakened the queen's immediate circle of support. Isolation developed quietly. The queen still possessed her title and ceremonial authority, but the network surrounding her became less secure. Fewer voices within the palace repeated her perspective or defended her reputation. Meanwhile, the influence of those aligned with the mistress continued to expand. Courtiers observing these changes often understood their significance. They recognized that control over personnel meant control over access. Those who stood near the monarch during daily routines could shape what information reached him and how events were interpreted. A king surrounded by certain advisors might hear one version of events. A king surrounded by different attendants might hear another. Gradually, the atmosphere of the palace began to change. Conversations that once defended the queen's dignity became less frequent. Doubts about her loyalty or suitability appeared more openly within the corridors of the court. The shift did not require public confrontation. It unfolded through small administrative decisions that seemed unrelated to politics. A new attendant here, a reassignment there, a trusted servant replaced quietly by someone else. Each adjustment altered the structure of relationships within the palace. By the time observers recognized the pattern, the queen's position within the social life of the court had already weakened. Her ceremonial role remained unchanged, yet her influence over the daily environment of the palace had diminished. The network of voices that once supported her presence now seemed scattered or silent. Meanwhile, the circle surrounding the king's favoured companion continued to grow stronger. These developments demonstrated how power in the Tudor court could move through subtle channels rather than public declarations. Personnel decisions that appeared routine could gradually reshape the balance of loyalty within the palace. Through these quiet adjustments, the distance between the queen and the centre of influence slowly widened. Control within the Tudor palace often depended on who stood closest to the monarch during daily life. Changes and servants, attendants, and advisors quietly altered how information moved through the court. As these shifts accumulated, the queen could remain visible in ceremony, while slowly drifting away from the true center of power. Ceremony in the Tudor court was designed to display stability. Processions moved slowly through great halls filled with banners and polished armor. Nobles stood in careful order according to rank. Musicians played while courtiers bowed as the king and queen entered together. From the outside, the image suggested a kingdom guided by harmony and clear authority. The queen's presence formed an essential part of that image. Her crown, her robes, and her place beside the king represented the lawful foundation of the royal household. She symbolized the marriage that connected alliances, secured legitimacy, and promised future heirs. When she appeared during public ceremonies, the court witnessed a figure whose authority seemed protected by tradition, religion, and law. Yet, appearance could conceal a different reality. Power within the Tudor palace did not depend solely on titles or ceremony. It also depended on influence, access, and the quiet movement of loyalty among courtiers. These elements were rarely visible during public rituals, yet they shaped how decisions were made behind the scenes. A queen might retain every symbol of her position while gradually losing the ability to shape events around her. The process often began subtly. At first, the queen's household might notice small changes in the atmosphere of the court. Conversations that once included her attendance began to take place elsewhere. Invitations to private gatherings might arrive less frequently. Courtiers, who had once visited her chambers regularly, might now appear distracted or distant. None of these changes seemed dramatic on their own. They appeared as ordinary fluctuations within the social life of the palace. The Tudor court was a busy environment where alliances shifted and personal rivalries developed quickly. A single missed conversation or delayed visit could easily be explained by other obligations. Over time, however, the pattern became more difficult to ignore. The queen continued to perform her public role with dignity. She appeared beside the king during official ceremonies. She presided over formal occasions within her household. To the wider kingdom, the structure of the royal marriage seemed unchanged. Yet within the palace, attention began to move elsewhere. Courtiers who wished to remain close to the center of influence gradually adjusted their behavior. They watched carefully to see whose opinions the king valued most. If another voice began to carry greater weight in private discussions, the court's social gravity could slowly shift toward that person. Such changes rarely required open conflict. A mistress who enjoyed the king's favor might attract visitors who hoped to strengthen their own position. Noble families seeking opportunity might encourage their daughters or relatives to maintain friendly relations with their household. In time, these connections created a parallel circle of influence within the palace. This circle did not replace the queen's authority openly. Instead, it existed beside it. The queen still occupied the formal center of the ceremony, yet the daily flow of conversation and advice might begin to move through different channels. Decisions about alliances, appointments, or policy could be discussed in places where the queen's voice carried little weight. Observers inside the court understood these signals clearly. They recognized that authority was not measured only by visible symbols. Access to the king's thoughts and attention often mattered more than the appearance of rank. When that access shifted, the balance of influence within the palace changed as well. For the queen, this transformation could be difficult to confront directly. Her title remained secure, and tradition demanded that she maintain dignity in public. Open conflict with the king or his companions risked damaging her reputation. As a result, she often continued performing her ceremonial role even while the environment around her quietly altered. Meanwhile, courtiers adapted quickly to the new reality. Those who sensed where influence was growing adjusted their loyalties accordingly. Conversations that once revolved around the queen's household gradually centered on different chambers within the palace. Rumors spread through the corridors, suggesting that the king's confidence had begun to favor another voice. The queen's crown, therefore, remained visible, but the authority that the crown symbolized no longer shaped the court in the same way. This quiet separation between title and influence created a striking contradiction within the Tudor palace. Public ceremony still presented the Queen as a pillar of stability. Yet the daily decisions that guided the kingdom increasingly formed elsewhere. Few outside the palace could recognize this change. The image of order remained intact. Processions continued. Banners were raised, and the Queen stood beside the king during official occasions. Only those living within the palace corridors understood how far the centre of influence had begun to move. In this way, the Tudor court demonstrated that power could drift gradually without altering the symbols that represented it. A crown could remain firmly in place, yet the voice beneath it might grow quieter with each passing day. The Tudor Queen could still appear beside the king, wearing the crown that symbolized lawful authority. Yet influence within the palace often depended less on ceremony than on access to the king's private attention. As that attention shifted elsewhere, the balance of the court slowly began to lean in a different direction. The future of a Tudor dynasty depended heavily on one question that echoed quietly through the palace halls. Who would inherit the crown? Kings ruled vast territories, commanded armies, and issued laws that shaped the kingdom. Yet the stability of their reign ultimately rested on the existence of a legitimate heir. For Tudor rulers, the heir was expected to be a son. The belief in male succession dominated political thinking across Europe during the 16th century. A prince promised continuity. He represented stability for the realm and security for noble families whose fortunes depended on the order of inheritance. Without a son, the future of the kingdom appeared uncertain. This expectation placed enormous pressure on royal marriages. A queen was not only a partner in the ceremony, but also the woman responsible for producing the next ruler. Every pregnancy, every birth, and every rumor about fertility carried political meaning far beyond the walls of the palace. The court watched closely. When a queen became pregnant, the news spread rapidly through noble households and foreign courts. Diplomatic observers wrote reports describing her health, her behavior, and even the smallest details surrounding the royal household. A healthy son would strengthen alliances and reassure the kingdom that the dynasty would continue. But the absence of a male heir produced anxiety. Each passing year without a prince deepened the unease within the court. Ministers began to discuss succession quietly among themselves. Noble families wondered how the future might unfold if the king died without a son to inherit the throne. In such an environment, personal relationships could acquire enormous political weight. A mistress who held the king's affection might find herself drawn into these discussions, even if her role was never acknowledged publicly. Her presence created a contrast that could shape how the king perceived his marriage. The queen represented tradition, law, and diplomatic alliance. The mistress represented possibility. This difference did not need to be spoken aloud. It existed naturally within the circumstances of the court. If the queen had failed to produce a male heir, doubts about the future could slowly transform into doubts about the marriage itself. Those doubts could be encouraged through careful suggestion. A trusted companion might remind the king of the fragile position of the dynasty. The absence of a prince could be described not simply as misfortune, but as a serious threat to the stability of the realm. Conversations about heirs often carried a tone of urgency that made the issue appear unavoidable. Gradually, the king might begin to see his marriage through a political lens. What had once been a personal union now appeared connected to the future of the kingdom. The question of succession transformed private disappointment into a matter of national importance. The mistress's presence intensified this contrast. If she appeared youthful or fertile, the difference between her and the queen could become more visible in the king's mind. Even the possibility that she might produce a son carried symbolic power. Such possibilities required no guarantees. The mere suggestion of a different future could reshape the king's thinking. If another relationship promised the chance of an heir, the existing marriage might begin to seem like an obstacle rather than a foundation. Courtiers observing the situation understood how sensitive this issue was. They recognized that succession questions often shaped the most dramatic political decisions of the Tudor era. Debates about legitimacy, inheritance, and the authority of the church frequently revolved around the king's desire to secure a male heir. The pressure placed upon the queen, therefore, became immense. Her health, to her age, and her past pregnancies were discussed openly among courtiers who had no personal connection to her. Each miscarriage or stillbirth intensified the atmosphere of uncertainty surrounding the royal marriage. At the same time, the mistress's position could grow stronger. She did not need to make direct claims about succession. Her existence alone introduced the possibility that the king might choose a different path in pursuit of an heir. Within the quiet rooms of the palace, such possibilities carried enormous influence. Conversations about heirs appeared practical and responsible. Ministers believed they were protecting the stability of the kingdom. Advisors believed they were guiding the king toward decisions that would secure the dynasty. Yet the origins of these discussions often lay in the most private areas of royal life. The question of succession blurred the boundary between personal desire and national policy. A king's longing for a son could reshape alliances, challenge religious authority, and alter the course of the kingdom's future. Inside the Tudor court, therefore, the issue of heirs became more than a biological matter. It became a political instrument capable of transforming relationships and shifting power within the palace. A queen might retain her crown, yet the absence of a prince could weaken her position. Meanwhile, a mistress who seemed capable of offering the promise of a son might gain influence far beyond her official role. Through this quiet tension, the future of the dynasty hovered constantly over the daily life of the court. The Tudor dynasty depended heavily on the birth of a legitimate male heir. As doubts about succession deepened, private relationships within the palace began to carry political consequences. At that moment, the royal marriage itself could begin to appear not as a solution, but as a problem waiting to be resolved. Royal marriages in the Tudor world were never purely private arrangements. From the moment a queen entered the palace, her marriage represented a political alliance between powerful families, foreign kingdoms, and religious authorities. The union of a king and queen, therefore, carried meaning far beyond affection or companionship. For this reason, questioning a royal marriage meant questioning the stability of the realm itself. At first, such questions rarely appeared openly. The court moved carefully around delicate matters that involved the dignity of the crown. Ministers, diplomats, and church officials preferred to speak in cautious language rather than direct accusation. Yet doubts could grow slowly within these conversations. When concerns about succession had already unsettled the court, attention naturally turned toward the structure of the marriage. If the royal union had failed to produce a secure heir, courtiers began examining the circumstances that created the marriage in the first place. Old alliances suddenly appeared open to interpretation. Some ministers might recall that the marriage had been arranged during a different political climate. Others might suggest that the agreement had served the interests of earlier rulers rather than the present king. What once seemed a wise diplomatic decision could now appear outdated or even mistaken. These discussions rarely began with dramatic declarations. Instead, they emerged through quiet reflection about the kingdom's future. Advisors might frame their concerns as questions rather than accusations. They might ask whether the existing marriage truly served the stability of the dynasty. Such questions carried powerful implications. If the marriage was linked to an alliance that no longer benefited the kingdom, its political value could appear weaker than before. Diplomats might observe that relationships with foreign powers had changed. Alliances once considered essential might now seem less necessary. Gradually, the royal marriage became part of a larger political debate. This transformation altered how courtiers viewed the queen's position. She was no longer seen only as the lawful partner of the king. She also represented the political agreement that had brought her into the kingdom. If that agreement appeared flawed, her role could be reconsidered. Within the council chamber, ministers might begin discussing the legal foundations of the marriage. Church law governed royal unions, and theologians possessed the authority to interpret questions of legitimacy. Their opinions carried enormous weight in matters involving marriage and annulment. Arguments about legality, therefore, became central. Advisors might search for details within the original marriage arrangement that could be interpreted differently. A forgotten clause, a disputed ceremony, or an unusual circumstance surrounding the union could become the focus of long debates among church scholars. These debates did not necessarily accuse the Queen of wrongdoing. Instead, they examined whether the marriage itself had been formed under conditions that church law considered valid. The question was not personal guilt but legal correctness. Once this line of reasoning began, the possibility of annulment entered political discussion. An annulment did not mean that a marriage had failed emotionally. It meant that the union had never been fully legitimate under religious law. Such a declaration could allow the king to remarry without appearing to violate moral or legal principles. To many advisors, this approach offered a solution to the growing anxiety about succession. If the marriage were declared invalid, the king would be free to form a new union capable of producing an heir. The stability of the dynasty could be restored while maintaining the appearance of lawful conduct. Yet this transformation, from private marriage to national concern, did not occur overnight. It developed through layers of discussion, interpretation, and persuasion. Each conversation within the council added another piece to the argument that the marriage itself had become a political obstacle. Courtiers observing the situation could sense the shift. What had once been considered an unchangeable foundation of the kingdom was now treated as a problem that required resolution. The Queen's presence within the palace remained visible, yet the meaning of her marriage was being redefined by those around the king. Publicly, nothing appeared different. Ceremonies continued. Diplomatic messages referred to the Queen with proper respect. The structure of the royal household remained intact. Privately, however, the debate had already begun. Lawyers examined documents. Clergymen discussed theological interpretations. Advisors weighed the risks of altering a royal marriage that had once symbolized political unity. Through these quiet preparations, the king's personal dissatisfaction gradually transformed into a question of national policy. The issue was no longer simply whether the marriage pleased the king. The issue had become whether the marriage served the kingdom. Within the Tudor court, such a transformation carried enormous consequences. Once a royal union was treated as a matter of state, the path toward annulment could appear not only possible but necessary. A royal marriage that once symbolized a political alliance slowly became the focus of national debate. Questions about legality and diplomatic value transformed private dissatisfaction into a public concern for the kingdom. From that moment onward, the fate of the marriage rested not only in the royal household, but within the judgment of the council. Within the Tudor court, political decisions rarely appeared in their original emotional form. Personal frustration, disappointment, or resentment could exist quietly within the king's mind. Yet these feelings alone could not shape national policy. For a decision to become official, it had to pass through the formal language of law, religion, and governance. This transformation was essential. A king might privately feel trapped in a marriage that no longer satisfied him. He might worry about the future of the dynasty or resent the pressures placed upon his authority. Yet none of these emotions could be presented openly before the council as the foundation of a political decision. Instead, those feelings had to be translated into arguments that appeared rational and lawful. The council chamber required logic rather than sentiment. Ministers expected to hear reasons grounded in legal tradition, religious interpretation, and the welfare of the kingdom. Personal dissatisfaction needed to be reshaped into a problem that demanded official action. This process often began with the careful framing of the king's concerns. Advisors who understood the delicate situation avoided speaking about emotion directly. Rather than discussing disappointment or affection, they spoke about legitimacy, succession, and the stability of the crown. These themes carried far greater authority within political discussions. Gradually, the king's private unease could be presented as a matter of national interest. If the royal marriage threatened the production of an heir, the issue became political rather than personal. If questions about the legality of the union existed under church law, the matter required examination by theologians and legal scholars. Through these arguments, personal dissatisfaction gained the language of necessity. Lawyers began studying documents related to the marriage. They examined the circumstances of the ceremony and the permissions granted by the church. Each detail offered the possibility of a legal interpretation that might support the king's desire for change. The role of religious authority proved particularly significant. The Tudor monarchy operated within a society deeply shaped by Christian doctrine. Marriage was considered a sacred union governed by church law. Any attempt to dissolve such a union required justification within that religious framework. For this reason, theologians were invited to analyze the situation. They debated whether the marriage had been valid according to canonical law. They discussed whether certain conditions surrounding the union might render it questionable in the eyes of the church. These debates gave the king's private concerns a new structure grounded in scholarship and legal reasoning. The council could now approach the issue with apparent objectivity. Ministers who might have hesitated to support a purely personal decision could accept an argument framed as a matter of law. If scholars concluded that the marriage contained legal irregularities, the council could present its recommendations as responsible governance rather than indulgence of royal emotion. Step by step, the tone of the discussion changed. The king's dissatisfaction became described as concern for the kingdom. His desire for change appeared as a commitment to dynastic stability. The language of emotion faded, replaced by the language of legal obligation. This transformation allowed the council to act without appearing reckless. Advisors could claim they were protecting the future of the realm. Church officials could argue that they were defending the proper interpretation of sacred law. Diplomats could explain the situation to foreign courts as a necessary correction rather than a scandal. By the time official statements emerged, the original emotions were almost invisible. The decision appeared structured, deliberate, and justified by careful reasoning. Documents described the legal arguments supporting the king's position. Religious authorities debated the issue with solemn seriousness. To observers, the outcome seemed inevitable. Yet behind this formal presentation lay a simpler origin. The process had begun with personal dissatisfaction expressed in a private conversation. Through layers of interpretation and argument, that dissatisfaction gradually evolved into an official decree. Such transformations were common within the Tudor political world. Personal motivations rarely appeared openly within royal policy. Instead, they passed through systems of law and administration that reshaped them into decisions that appeared necessary for the kingdom. The king's authority allowed this transformation to occur. Once the council accepted the legal reasoning behind the decision, the final step could be taken. The matter would move from discussion into action, expressed through formal proclamations and official rulings. What had once been a private concern within the royal household could therefore become a defining moment in national politics. In the Tudor court, emotion might begin the process. Law and authority completed it. Private disappointment within the royal household slowly transformed into arguments about law and succession. Through legal debates and religious interpretation, personal emotion acquired the language of political necessity. Soon, the council would believe it was acting for the kingdom, even though the first spark had been lit in a far quieter place. Debates inside the Tudor council chamber often carried the tone of careful deliberation. Ministers gathered around heavy wooden tables, documents spread before them, speaking in measured voices about law, succession, and the stability of the kingdom. Each participant believed that the discussion represented rational judgment rather than personal influence. From their perspective, the process appeared orderly. Members of the council examined legal arguments with seriousness. They questioned the interpretations presented by scholars. They weighed the potential consequences of altering the royal marriage and considered how foreign courts might respond. These men saw themselves as guardians of the realm. Their duty was to advise the king with honesty and reason. They believed that their conclusions emerged from careful analysis of facts rather than manipulation or hidden persuasion. Each speech, delivered in the chamber, sounded like an attempt to protect the future of the kingdom. Yet the foundation of the debate had formed long before the council assembled. The doubts being discussed did not originate in the chamber itself. They had grown gradually through private conversations that occurred in quieter parts of the palace. The council members now examined conclusions whose origins they did not fully recognize. To them, the arguments appeared to arise naturally from the situation. Questions about succession seemed obvious. Legal concerns about the marriage appeared legitimate. Religious authorities offered interpretations that sounded convincing within the traditions of the church. Each element of the discussion seemed reasonable on its own. This sense of legitimacy allowed the council to proceed with confidence. Ministers believed they were confronting a problem that had revealed itself through careful observation of political reality. The church approached the matter with a similar conviction. Clergymen reviewing the marriage examined theological principles that governed Christian unions. They studied canonical texts and debated interpretations among scholars. Their language was precise and formal, rooted in centuries of religious tradition. From their perspective, they were defending sacred law. The possibility that the marriage might be invalid was treated as a matter of doctrine rather than royal preference. Church authorities believed they were fulfilling their duty by examining whether the union conformed to the moral rules established by religious authority. Because of this belief, their involvement gave the debate enormous legitimacy. When theologians raised legal doubts about the marriage, the council gained confidence in its conclusions. Ministers could now claim that both law and religion pointed toward the same outcome. The structure of the discussion reinforced this impression. Council members examined documents, consulted advisors, and compared interpretations offered by scholars. Each stage of the process seemed to confirm that the matter required careful resolution rather than emotional reaction. Gradually, the debate produced a sense of inevitability. If the marriage contained legal uncertainty, it required clarification. If succession remained insecure, the dynasty demanded protection. These conclusions appeared to arise naturally from the evidence presented before the council. A few participants questioned how the discussion had begun. The origins of the debate lay far outside the formal structure of government. A conversation shared in a private chamber, shaped by personal relationships and quiet influence, had planted the first seeds of doubt. By the time those doubts reached the council, they no longer appeared personal. They seemed to belong to the logic of politics itself. This transformation illustrates how power often operated within the Tudor court. Influence rarely forced decisions directly. Instead, it shaped the conditions under which decisions appeared necessary. Council members believed they were acting independently. Their discussions sounded thoughtful and responsible. Each argument appeared grounded in evidence and law. Every participant could explain their position through logic rather than loyalty. Yet the path they followed had already been prepared. The doubts guiding their debate had travelled through corridors of private influence before reaching the council table. What seemed like spontaneous political reasoning had been carefully cultivated through earlier conversations. By the time the council recognized the seriousness of the issue, the direction of the debate had already been shaped. Ministers might adjust details or refine arguments, but the fundamental question had been established long before their deliberations began. This subtle influence remained largely invisible. To those inside the chamber, the process looked like independent judgment. They believed the conclusion would emerge naturally from the evidence before them. The truth was quieter. Political reasoning often grows from seeds planted elsewhere. In the Tudor court, the council chamber did not always make decisions. Sometimes it simply confirmed them. Council members believed they were analysing the situation with objective judgment. Church authorities believed they were defending the authority of sacred law. Few realised that the first spark of the entire debate had begun as a quiet conversation far from the council table. The position of a Tudor queen did not depend only on her marriage to the king. It also depended on the network of alliances that surrounded her. Noble families connected through diplomacy, marriage arrangements, and long-standing loyalty formed a protective circle that strengthened her authority within the court. These alliances extended far beyond the palace walls. Foreign relatives, ambassadors, and powerful noble houses often supported the queen's position because her marriage represented a bond between kingdoms. Her presence within England, therefore, carried diplomatic meaning as well as personal significance. Because of this, weakening the queen's alliances required careful strategy. Confrontation with these networks would have created open conflict within the court, and possibly even tension with foreign powers. Instead, influence often worked through quieter adjustments that gradually reduced the queen's visibility and authority. The first step involved distancing her from her traditional supporters. Members of the queen's household, who maintained close ties with her family, could quietly disappear from influential positions. Some were reassigned to distant duties. Others found themselves excluded from gatherings where political discussions occurred. These changes rarely appeared hostile. Official explanations described them as ordinary administrative decisions. A court appointment might end with polite gratitude. A trusted advisor might receive an assignment in another region of the kingdom. On the surface, these developments seemed unrelated to the queen herself. Yet the pattern slowly altered the structure of her support. Each removal weakened the circle of individuals who could defend her interests within the palace. Without these voices nearby, the queen's perspective became less visible during important conversations. At the same time, her public presence could begin to shrink. The Tudor court placed great importance on ceremony and appearance. When the queen participated in religious services, celebrations, or diplomatic receptions, her visibility reinforced the legitimacy of her position. Reducing those appearances changed how the court perceived her. If the queen attended fewer events, courtiers naturally wondered about the reason. Some assumed illness or fatigue. Others interpreted the absence as a sign that her influence had declined. In a court where reputation shaped political survival, perception mattered greatly. The less frequently the queen appeared before the public, the easier it became for rumours to replace direct observation. People who once saw her regularly now relied on second-hand reports to understand her situation. Those reports often carried subtle interpretations. A quiet comment might suggest that the queen preferred to remain private. Another might hint that she had withdrawn from court life by choice. None of these explanations sounded openly hostile. Yet together, they shaped a new narrative. The queen's absence slowly became part of the court's normal expectation. Meanwhile, the presence of other figures within the palace could grow stronger. Individuals who enjoyed the king's attention appeared more frequently during gatherings and ceremonies. Courtiers eager to remain close to influence naturally gravitated toward these visible centers of power. Gradually, the social gravity of the court began to shift. Where courtiers once gathered around the queen's apartments, they now visited other chambers more often. Conversations about the future of the kingdom took place in rooms where her voice carried little authority. The queen still retained her formal dignity. Her title remained unchanged. Official documents referred to her with respect. When she did appear in public, the rituals surrounding her position remained intact. Yet these symbols could not fully conceal the deeper transformation. Without strong alliances surrounding her, the queen stood increasingly alone within the political landscape of the court. Diplomats who once defended her interests became cautious. Noble families that had supported her position began to reconsider their loyalty. Public perception also evolved. If the queen appeared less frequently and fewer powerful voices defended her reputation, the image of her authority gradually faded. Courtiers, who once regarded her as a central figure, now treated her presence with polite distance rather than active support. This shift occurred quietly but steadily. No dramatic decree announced her isolation. No official statement declared that her influence had diminished. Instead, the transformation unfolded through absence, reassignment, and the subtle withdrawal of loyalty. In the Tudor court, such silence could be more powerful than open confrontation. By removing the networks that sustained the Queen's authority, the balance of influence within the palace changed naturally. Without those connections, her ability to shape events became increasingly limited. Observers inside the court could sense the difference. They noticed which chambers were filled with visitors and which remained quiet. They saw whose opinions travelled quickly through the corridors and whose words seemed to disappear without echo. Through these signals, the Queen's position slowly weakened. She still wore the crown, but the alliances that once supported it had begun to fade. The strength of a Tudor queen depended not only on her title, but on the alliances that surrounded her. As those alliances quietly disappeared, her presence within the court became less visible and less influential. Soon, another force would begin to shape how the kingdom judged her place within the royal marriage. Religion shaped nearly every aspect of life in Tudor England. Churches dominated the skyline of towns and villages. Bells marked the hours of prayer. Sermons guided the moral expectations of the population. Within this deeply religious world, questions of virtue and purity carried enormous authority. For a queen, reputation in matters of morality mattered as much as political loyalty. The queen represented not only royal dignity, but also the moral image of the kingdom. Her conduct symbolized discipline, piety, and the proper order of Christian marriage. Because of this symbolic role, any suggestion that her character might fall short of these ideals could weaken her position in ways that political arguments alone could not achieve. Doubt about morality moved differently from political criticism. Political disagreements required evidence and debate within councils. Moral suspicion spread quietly through conversation and interpretation. A raised eyebrow during a sermon, a remark from a confessor, or a whispered observation within the court could carry significant weight. These small signals rarely accused the Queen directly. Instead, they invited others to question her image indirectly. Someone might comment that the royal household no longer reflected the harmony expected of a Christian marriage. Another might wonder whether spiritual guidance within the palace had weakened over time. Such remarks sounded cautious and respectful, yet they planted uncertainty within the religious imagination of the court. In Tudor society, religious leaders possessed enormous influence over public opinion. Priests and scholars interpreted scripture and guided moral understanding. When these figures discussed questions of marriage or virtue, their words shaped how people viewed the actions of rulers. Because of this authority, moral language could transform political conflict into spiritual concern. A debate about royal marriage could therefore shift from diplomacy to doctrine. The focus moved away from alliances or succession and toward questions about whether the union itself reflected divine intention. This shift changed the tone of the discussion throughout the court. Instead of asking whether the marriage was politically useful, observers began asking whether it was spiritually correct. The difference appeared subtle, yet it altered the entire framework of the argument. Religious interpretation could now provide a powerful justification for change. Scholars might revisit earlier theological debates about marriage. They might examine passages of scripture related to family relationships, inheritance, and moral order. Each interpretation offered new ways to question whether the royal union truly aligned with religious law. None of these discussions required personal accusation. They focused instead on principles. Clergymen spoke about purity, legitimacy, and obedience to divine authority. The Queen's situation appeared within these broader debates without being named as the central target. Over time, however, the implications became clear. If the marriage itself seemed spiritually questionable, maintaining it could appear irresponsible. Religious arguments carried a tone of moral urgency that political reasoning alone could not match. Courtiers listening to these interpretations began to reconsider the situation. They were not simply witnessing a dispute within the royal household. They were witnessing what seemed to be a conflict between human decisions and divine order. Such a perception gave enormous weight to calls for change. A decision that might have looked controversial within politics could appear righteous when framed through religion. Removing a marriage that violated moral law could be presented as an act of obedience to God rather than a personal preference of the king. Public discussion gradually reflected this new framing. Whispers within the palace corridors began to include religious language. Observers spoke about conscience, purity, and the responsibility of rulers to respect divine law. These ideas travelled beyond the palace through sermons and conversations among clergy. The debate, therefore, expanded beyond the royal household. People throughout the kingdom began hearing arguments about the moral legitimacy of the marriage. Even those who knew little about the political situation understood the authority of religious teaching. Religion had become a tool that shaped perception. It allowed critics of the marriage to speak in the language of faith rather than accusation. Their arguments appeared principled and sincere, grounded in spiritual responsibility rather than ambition. Within the council, these interpretations strengthened legal arguments already under discussion. If church scholars suggested that the marriage violated religious law, the council gained new justification for reconsidering its legitimacy. Political leaders could claim they were acting in accordance with divine guidance rather than personal influence. This combination of law and morality proved extremely powerful. A decision supported by both legal reasoning and religious interpretation appeared nearly impossible to challenge. Opponents risked being portrayed not only as political rivals, but also as defenders of moral error. Through this process, religion quietly reshaped the political landscape of the Tudor court. What began as private dissatisfaction within the royal marriage now carried the language of spiritual duty. The possibility of removing the queen no longer appeared simply political. It appeared righteous. And once a decision is framed as obedience to moral law, resistance becomes far more difficult. Religion in Tudor England held the power to shape how people understood authority and legitimacy. When moral language entered the debate about the royal marriage, political conflict began to look like a matter of spiritual responsibility. Before long, the court would discover that public opinion could be guided just as carefully as royal policy. Rumours moved through Tudor society with a quiet persistence that official announcements rarely achieved. They travelled along market stalls, through churchyards, across tavern tables, and along the corridors of noble households. In a world where printed information remained limited and slow, conversation served as the most powerful network of communication. Because of this, rumours possessed a remarkable ability to shape public perception. Within the royal court, few statements were made openly about delicate matters, such as the king's marriage. Yet people observed changes. A queen who appeared less frequently in public ceremonies raised questions. Courtiers, who suddenly avoided her apartments, created silent signals that something had shifted within the palace. These signals did not remain confined to the court. Servants carried stories beyond palace gates. Merchants who supplied the royal household spoke with customers in the markets. Diplomats wrote letters to foreign courts describing the atmosphere they sensed in London. Through these channels, fragments of information began to spread. No single rumour needed to contain the entire truth. Each small story contributed to a larger impression forming within the public mind. People heard hints about tensions within the royal household, whispers about disagreements among advisors, and speculation about the future of the queen. At first, these rumours sounded uncertain. Listeners treated them cautiously, unsure whether the stories reflected genuine developments or merely the imagination of gossip. Yet repetition gave the rumours weight. When the same suggestion appeared in several places, it began to feel less like speculation and more like a possibility. This process changed how society prepared itself for political change. If the public heard nothing before a sudden announcement, the shock could provoke confusion or resistance. Rumour served as a gradual introduction to ideas that might otherwise appear too abrupt. People began discussing the possibility of transformation long before it occurred. Within taverns and workshops, conversations turned toward the stability of the royal marriage. Some questioned whether the union still served the interests of the kingdom, Others repeated fragments of information about legal debates and religious arguments circulating among scholars. These discussions allowed the public to imagine outcomes that once seemed impossible. A royal marriage had traditionally been viewed as permanent. Yet once rumours began presenting alternative interpretations, that certainty weakened. People who heard repeated suggestions about legal or moral doubts could gradually accept the idea that change might occur. Meanwhile, the Queen's image slowly altered within these conversations. Public reputation relied heavily on visibility. When the Queen appeared frequently at ceremonies, festivals, and church services, people felt familiar with her presence. Absence created a space where imagination could replace observation. Rumours filled that space. Some stories suggested that the Queen had withdrawn from court life. Others hinted at tensions between the king and his advisors. Each story subtly shifted attention away from the Queen's authority and toward uncertainty surrounding her position. Over time, these whispers shaped a new narrative. The Queen was no longer discussed primarily as the stable partner of the king. Instead, she appeared in conversations about problems that required resolution. The change in tone happened gradually, almost imperceptibly. Few people recognized how deeply these rumors influenced perception. Most listeners believed they were simply sharing observations or repeating information they had heard elsewhere. Yet each repetition strengthened the emerging story surrounding the royal marriage. The court understood the power of such narratives. When rumors traveled through society, they prepared the public mind for developments that might soon appear in official form. The process allowed dramatic decisions to seem less sudden and more like the natural result of circumstances already widely discussed. In this way, rumor functioned as a quiet instrument of political preparation. By the time formal declarations reached the population, many people felt they had already heard hints of the outcome. The announcement, therefore, seemed less surprising than it might have been otherwise. This gradual adjustment proved extremely effective. Public acceptance rarely emerged from force alone. It required familiarity with the idea that change was possible. Rumours created that familiarity long before official proclamations appeared. Within Tudor England, the boundary between private gossip and public opinion was thin. What began as whispers among courtiers could travel across the kingdom through merchants, clergy, and travellers. Each voice added a layer to the developing narrative surrounding the Queen. Through repetition and speculation, her reputation slowly shifted. The woman, once recognized as the central figure of the royal marriage, now appeared within stories about uncertainty and doubt. Even without a direct accusation, the tone of conversation surrounding her had changed. Such transformations rarely happened suddenly. They emerged through hundreds of conversations carried across weeks and months. Each remark softened the public's attachment to the existing order while introducing the possibility of a new one. By the time official action approached, the public imagination had already begun adjusting to the idea. The Queen's image had been reshaped, not through decree, but through quiet erosion. In Tudor politics, rumour often prepared the ground where official decisions would later stand. Rumours moved through Tudor society as a quiet force shaping how people understood the royal marriage. Repeated whispers gradually changed the public image of the Queen and prepared the population for possible change. Before long, the court would discover that once public opinion begins to shift, events can move toward their outcome with surprising speed. Political decisions inside the Tudor court often appeared sudden to those watching from outside the palace walls. A proclamation might be read aloud, a decree sealed with royal authority, and the entire kingdom would hear that a major transformation had taken place. To observers across England, the change seemed abrupt and dramatic. Inside the palace, however, the transformation had usually begun much earlier, long before the final declaration reached the public. The conditions necessary for that decision had already taken shape. Conversations had circulated among advisors. Legal arguments had been refined by scholars. Rumours had travelled through both the court and the streets of the city. By the time the formal announcement arrived, much of the outcome had already been prepared. The Tudor political world rarely acted without such preparation. Decisions that affected the royal household, the church, and the stability of the kingdom required careful groundwork. Ministers understood that a sudden and unexplained change could provoke confusion or even resistance. Because of this, the process unfolded gradually. Legal debates examined the marriage from every possible angle. Religious authorities studied the spiritual legitimacy of the union. Advisors quietly adjusted alliances within the court so that potential opposition weakened over time. Each stage moved the kingdom closer to a moment that had not yet been declared. For the Queen, this gradual transformation could remain difficult to confront directly. Her title still existed. Official ceremonies continued to place her beside the king. The outward structure of the royal marriage appeared unchanged. Yet the atmosphere surrounding her position had altered. Courtiers who once supported her now hesitated to speak openly in her defense. Diplomatic observers noticed shifts in the tone of council discussions. Even the public conversation outside the palace had begun to reflect doubts about the future of the marriage. These signals revealed that the decision was already forming. The council chamber might still debate legal arguments. Yet many participants had already accepted the direction the situation was moving. Their discussions refined the details rather than determining the outcome itself. In such circumstances, resistance became extremely difficult. A queen confronting the process would not face a single opponent or accusation. Instead, she would encounter a network of interpretations, rumors, and legal arguments that had gradually reshaped how others viewed her position. The transformation appeared diffuse and therefore powerful. No single voice could be identified as the architect of the change. Ministers spoke about the law. Clergymen discussed theology. Courtiers repeated rumors circulating through the palace. Each group believed it was responding to evidence rather than creating it. Yet together, they produced a political environment in which the original marriage seemed impossible to maintain. By the time the final decree approached, many people within the court believed the outcome had become unavoidable. The decision felt less like a sudden break and more like the conclusion of a process that had been unfolding quietly for months. Official documents, therefore, served a particular purpose. They did not create the transformation, they confirmed it. When the king's seal appeared on a proclamation, the statement carried the authority of law. To the wider kingdom, the document represented the moment when change officially occurred. Inside the palace, however, most observers already understood what the proclamation would contain. Courtiers had watched alliances shift and rumors grow. Advisors had participated in debates that gradually narrowed the possible outcomes. Diplomats had written reports describing the direction of the court's thinking. The written decree merely translated these developments into formal language. Such moments revealed how Tudor politics often functioned. Power did not always operate through sudden commands. Instead, it shaped expectations gradually until the final declaration appeared natural and inevitable. This gradual preparation also affected the public response. When rumors and discussions had already circulated widely, the population felt less surprised by the official announcement. Many people believed they had sensed the coming change long before it was confirmed. For the Queen, this meant the opportunity for resistance had quietly disappeared. By the time the decree emerged, the alliances that might have defended her position had weakened. Public opinion had begun adjusting to the idea of transformation. Even the council members debating the issue had already accepted its likely conclusion. The official statement, therefore, marked the end of a process rather than its beginning. What seemed like a sudden royal decision was actually the final step in a long chain of conversations, interpretations, and shifting loyalties. The Queen's crown might still rest upon her head during the ceremony, yet the political world surrounding that crown had already moved elsewhere. By the time the royal decree appeared, the transformation within the Tudor court had already taken shape. Legal debates, shifting alliances, and public rumor had quietly prepared the kingdom for a different reality. The final proclamation, therefore, confirmed a change that had long since become impossible to resist. Few events in Tudor history illustrate the mixture of personal emotion and political transformation more clearly than the relationship between Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn. What began as a private attraction gradually reshaped the legal, religious, and political structure of the English kingdom. At the centre of this story stood a marriage that had once symbolised stability. Catherine of Aragon had been Queen of England for many years. Her marriage to Henry VIII had originally strengthened diplomatic ties between England and Spain, two powerful kingdoms seeking influence in Europe. Catherine's dignity, intelligence, and strong religious devotion earned her respect throughout the court. For a long time, her position seemed secure. She had fulfilled the expectations placed upon a Tudor queen in many ways. She represented a respected royal family, maintained the ceremonial responsibilities of the crown, and supported the king during moments of political difficulty. Yet one problem overshadowed all others. Catherine had not produced a surviving male heir. Several pregnancies ended in tragedy. Children were born, but did not live long enough to secure the future of the dynasty. Only one child survived into adulthood, the Princess Mary, for Henry Oft. This situation created deep anxiety. A Tudor king understood that the stability of the realm depended heavily on the presence of a legitimate son. Without such an heir, the future of the kingdom appeared uncertain. Rival claims could emerge. Noble families might compete for influence, and political unrest could follow. Within this atmosphere of uncertainty, Anne Boleyn entered the royal court. Anne had spent years in continental Europe, where she received a refined education and learned the customs of sophisticated royal households. When she arrived in England, her intelligence and confidence distinguished her from many other women at court. Henry VIII soon became fascinated by her. Unlike many royal favourites, Anne refused to become the king's mistress in the traditional sense. She insisted on maintaining a distance that transformed Henry's interest into determination. Her refusal created a situation that forced the king to confront the limitations of his existing marriage. Gradually, Henry's attention toward Catherine shifted. The absence of a male heir, combined with his growing attachment to Anne, created a powerful emotional conflict. What had once been a stable marriage began to appear as an obstacle to the future he desired. Within the court, advisors observed this change. Some recognized that the king's frustration could lead to significant political consequences. Discussions about succession, legitimacy, and the future of the dynasty began circulating with increasing urgency. Anne's presence, therefore, became more than a personal matter. Her relationship with Henry introduced the possibility that the royal marriage itself might change. If the king believed a different union could produce a son, the political structure supporting his marriage to Catherine might no longer appear secure. Legal and religious arguments soon followed. Scholars began examining whether Henry's marriage to Catherine had been valid under church law. Catherine had previously been married to Henry's brother, Arthur, and although special permission from the Pope had allowed Henry to marry her, some theologians argued that the union still raised moral concerns. These interpretations gave Henry a new way to frame his dissatisfaction. The issue could now be presented not simply as personal frustration, but as a matter of religious legitimacy. If the marriage violated divine law, correcting that mistake could appear necessary for both the king's conscience and the stability of the realm. The debate eventually grew large enough to involve the highest authorities of the church. Henry sought approval from the Pope to annul the marriage. Catherine defended her position firmly, insisting that her union with Henry had been lawful and sacred. The conflict soon extended beyond the royal household. Diplomatic alliances became entangled in the dispute. Catherine's powerful relatives in Spain and the Holy Roman Empire supported her claim as the rightful queen. European courts watched closely as England wrestled with the consequences of Henry's determination. Anne Boleyn remained at the centre of this transformation. Her relationship with the king intensified his desire to resolve the situation. While she did not control the political machinery of the court, her presence influenced the direction of the king's decisions. Eventually, the conflict produced one of the most dramatic developments in English history. Henry rejected papal authority over the English Church and declared himself the supreme head of the Church of England. This decision allowed him to annul his marriage to Catherine and marry Anne Boleyn. The consequences reached far beyond the royal family. England's relationship with Rome changed permanently. Religious institutions throughout the kingdom faced new authority. Political power shifted in ways that reshaped the future of the country. Through this series of events, personal affection and political transformation became inseparable. The king's relationship with Anne Boleyn had begun as a private matter within the royal court. Over time, it evolved into a national crisis that altered the religious and political identity of England. The story illustrates how influence within the Tudor court rarely remained confined to private life. A relationship that began with personal attraction could ultimately reshape the structure of an entire kingdom. The relationship between Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn revealed how personal emotion could transform the political landscape of Tudor England. The fall of Catherine of Aragon demonstrated how fragile even the most established royal marriage could become. Soon, the court would witness that the victory gained through private influence could carry dangers as great as the power it created. Becoming queen did not always guarantee security within the Tudor court. The crown itself symbolized authority. But the circumstances that brought a woman to that position often determined how stable her power truly was. When a mistress rose to the throne through the affection of the king, the foundation of her authority could remain fragile. At first, the transformation appeared dramatic. A woman who had once stood outside the formal structure of royal marriage now entered the palace as queen. Her apartments expanded, her household grew larger, and her presence at ceremonies commanded the attention of the court. Diplomats addressed her with the language of royalty, and courtiers bowed as she passed through the great halls. Yet beneath this change lay an uncomfortable reality. The path that elevated her had been built upon personal attachment rather than long-standing political alliance. The same emotional force that had lifted her to the throne could shift again with time. In Tudor politics, stability depended heavily on tradition. Queens who arrived through carefully arranged diplomatic marriages often carried the support of powerful families and foreign allies. Their position rested upon treaties and established relationships that extended beyond the king's personal feelings. A queen who had once been a mistress possessed a different foundation. Her influence had grown through intimacy and proximity to the king, rather than through international alliance. While this closeness could produce remarkable influence, it also created vulnerability. Courtiers understood this distinction clearly. Many members of the nobility respected the authority of the crown, yet they also recognized that the new queen's position depended heavily on the king's continued affection. Their loyalty, therefore, remained cautious rather than absolute. The court watched carefully for signs of change. A shift in the king's attention could alter the balance of influence within the palace. New faces might appear more frequently in private chambers. Old allies might sense that their patronage was weakening. In such an environment, security remained uncertain, even for a crowned queen. History provided a clear example of this fragile triumph. Anne Boleyn, whose relationship with Henry VIII had helped transform the structure of the English Church, eventually discovered how unstable emotional power could become. Her rise had been extraordinary. Anne's influence over Henry encouraged the king to challenge papal authority and reshape the religious structure of England. For a moment, her position appeared unmatched within the Tudor court. She had succeeded where others had failed, becoming queen through determination and the king's devotion. Yet the same court that had witnessed her rise also observed her decline. Expectations surrounding her new role proved immense. The kingdom still required a male heir, and pressure surrounding succession remained intense. When Anne gave birth to a daughter rather than a son, uncertainty returned to the royal household. Political tensions began to grow again. Courtiers, who had once supported Anne, became cautious about associating their fortunes with her future. Rumours circulated, and accusations soon followed. In the unpredictable environment of the Tudor court, alliances could dissolve quickly when the king's confidence shifted. Anne's fate illustrated the dangers hidden within such victories. A queen who had risen through the king's affection could also fall through his suspicion. The emotional foundation of her authority offered little protection once that affection faded. This pattern reflected a broader cycle within royal courts. Power based on personal intimacy often produced dramatic influence in the short term. However, because it depended on the king's feelings rather than established political alliances, it remained vulnerable to change. Courtiers understood this cycle well. Some families hesitated to attach themselves fully to the new queen's household. They recognized that the court could transform rapidly if the king's attention moved elsewhere. Survival within Tudor politics required careful observation of these shifting relationships. The palace, therefore, existed within a constant tension. A mistress could rise to extraordinary influence, even to the throne itself. Yet the very circumstances that made such a rise possible also carried the seeds of instability. The king's affection functioned like a powerful current within the court. It could elevate one figure while quietly diminishing another. Courtiers adjusted their loyalties as they sensed the direction of that current, seeking to remain aligned with the strongest source of influence. For a queen whose authority rested upon this emotional foundation, maintaining stability required more than ceremonial power. She needed continued confidence from the king, support from influential advisors, and the ability to navigate the complex expectations of court politics. Without those elements, her position could weaken surprisingly quickly. The Tudor court, therefore, demonstrated a paradox. A private relationship could reshape the structure of an entire kingdom. Yet the triumph achieved through that relationship might contain its own vulnerability. A victory gained in the intimacy of the royal bedchamber could place a crown upon a woman's head. It could also place her within a dangerous cycle where affection determined survival. The rise of a mistress to the throne revealed how powerful personal influence could become within the Tudor court. Yet, authority built upon affection remained fragile in a world where loyalty shifted quickly. Soon, the court would confront the deeper lesson of these events, where private whispers left their mark upon the course of history itself. The Tudor court often appeared to be governed by visible authority. Kings issued decrees, councils debated policy, and bishops defended religious law. To anyone observing from a distance, the structure of power seemed clear and orderly. Decisions appeared to rise from the throne, supported by ministers and recorded in official documents. Yet the deeper movement of history often began in quieter places. Behind the public ceremonies of Tudor England existed a world of private conversation and personal influence. Royal apartments, gardens, and candlelit chambers became spaces where emotions and ambitions quietly shaped the thoughts of rulers. Within those rooms, ideas formed that later appeared before councils as matters of national policy. The boundary between private life and public authority was therefore thinner than it seemed. A king carried his personal concerns with him wherever he ruled. His fears about succession, his frustrations within marriage, and his attachments to those closest to him all influenced how he understood the kingdom. Advisors could guide his thinking, but his emotional world still affected the direction of his decisions. Because of this, individuals without formal power could still leave remarkable marks on history. A woman who held the king's attention might possess no official office, no legal authority, and no place within the council chamber. Yet through conversation, companionship, and emotional closeness, she could influence the ideas that later shaped national events. The Tudor court demonstrated this dynamic repeatedly. Relationships within the royal household influenced debates about succession, legitimacy, and religion. Private conversations sometimes introduced doubts or possibilities that advisors later examined through the language of law and theology. By the time those ideas appeared before ministers, they seemed like logical conclusions. Yet their origins often traced back to moments far removed from official debate. A quiet remark shared in confidence, an observation spoken during an evening conversation, or a suggestion offered during a moment of frustration could plant the first seed of transformation. From those seeds, political change gradually emerged. The council might believe it was responding to objective circumstances. Religious scholars might believe they were defending sacred principles. Diplomats might interpret the situation as a necessary adjustment in the balance of power. Each group acted according to its own understanding. Yet all of them were responding to a process that had begun long before the formal discussion started. The story of Tudor politics, therefore, reminds us that history rarely unfolds through grand declarations alone. Public decisions often grow from smaller and more personal beginnings. A whisper can become a rumor can become a concern can become a debate within the council, and eventually that debate can produce a decree that alters the direction of an entire nation. The Tudor court stands as a striking example of this chain of influence. Kings possessed enormous authority, yet they were still human beings whose emotions shaped their judgments. The people who shared their private world, therefore, occupied a unique position within the structure of power. Their influence remained unofficial, but deeply significant. A companion might never appear in a royal document, yet the conversations she shared with the king could echo through the decisions he later made before the council. This reality reveals something important about the nature of power itself. Authority does not always travel in straight lines from the throne to the law. Sometimes it moves through relationships, trust, and personal connection before entering the formal machinery of government. Within the Tudor court, these hidden pathways shaped the course of the kingdom. The king's personal life became intertwined with national policy. Private desires could reshape alliances, challenge religious institutions, and transform the structure of authority across the realm. To observers centuries later, the outcomes appear dramatic, yet the beginnings were often simple. A conversation held in a quiet room, a suggestion offered gently, a moment of personal uncertainty shared between two people who believed they were speaking only to each other. From such moments, history could begin to move. This truth remains one of the most fascinating aspects of the Tudor world. The same palace that hosted magnificent ceremonies and grand political debates also contained intimate spaces where ideas formed quietly before entering public life. Within those spaces, individuals without official titles could still influence the future of the kingdom. Their voices might never appear in official records, yet their influence could travel from the private chamber to the council table and eventually into the pages of history. The story of Tudor mistresses and queens, therefore, reveals more than personal rivalry or romantic intrigue. It shows how power, emotion, and politics became intertwined within one of the most dramatic courts in European history. Through these intertwined forces, the fate of a marriage could reshape the destiny of a nation. And sometimes, the first movement of that transformation began not in the council chamber, but in a quiet conversation that few people ever heard. Tonight, as the palace corridors grow quiet and the candles burn low, the story of Tudor power settles into silence. The voices that once whispered within royal chambers have faded into the distance. Yet their consequences remain written across the pages of history. Sleep well, and let the echoes of those distant halls drift softly through the night.